6th of June 1944, world's largest armada world's largest armada to that point, did an amphibious assault very successfully, gained a lodgment, built a bridgehead, which ultimately led to the defeat of Germany on the 9th of May 1945. So what happened after that? They made a movie, you know, The Longest Day, about the 6th of June, but nobody ever made a movie about the day after. What happened the day after? And we'll talk about that, because the day after is critical. The Germans knew very, very clearly that in order to defeat the Allies, they could not allow the Allies to gain lodgment, because what would happen is the Allied lodgment would lead to a buildup of men, material, which would ultimately overwhelm the Germans. No matter how good the Germans were, and they were good because of the training that they had and the experience that they had, they would be overwhelmed and they would lose. And the shortest way to Berlin was not from the east at that point in time, it was actually from the west. They knew that would happen. So their tactical plan was actually to do immediate counterattacks and drive the Allies into the sea. And that would give them another year. Another year would allow technological advancement, refinement of the army, and would at least allow them to have a stalemate or better peace conditions or potentially other scenarios. The Canadian Army faced them on that day. The Canadian Army held them. And because we were able to hold them at that time, the Allied armies were able to build up their bridgehead, and the bridgehead allowed the ultimate defeat of the German army. This was the German immediate counterattack. This was what could have driven the Allied armies back into the sea. And on the 7th of June, the Canadian Army, green, raw, inexperienced, held back extremely experienced German officers and extremely motivated German troops, and held it so that the rest of the Allied beachhead could actually build out. Most Canadians don't appreciate that. So we'll talk about that and some of the issues that happened during that time. So those are the phases of what we're going to talk about. These are some of the vehicles you're going to see later on, and yes, I know there's lots of infantry people in here. As an armor person, I like having tanks and pictures. So you're going to see some of that because they are critical to the fight. So those vehicles would have been in the fight on the 7th of June, 1944. So for those of you that remember your history, 6th of June, 1944, to that point in time, the largest armada invaded France. Almost the reverse course of what happened in 1066. It was the reverse from the UK into Normandy. And you had, again, starting on the western flank, Utah, followed by Bloody Omaha, followed by Gold, Juno, and Sword. The British and Canadian beaches here, Gold, Juno, Sword, with the Americans at Omaha and Utah. And again, the red areas here indicate the lodgment which was gained. So let's talk about the Uglies first. One of the key things that you'll often hear people say about Canadians is that, well, they took an awful lot of casualties and leadership was not that good. So what happened in Normandy is really, we should expect it because our leaders were not that good. And maybe it's because we're critical about ourselves and how we do our business, and maybe it's because we're holding ourselves in the standard of the forefathers of the 1st Canadian Corps, which was the Allied shock army and did amazing things in 1918. But when you look at the casualties are tied to a couple of things. They're tied to the leadership, no doubt about it. They're tied to materiel, they're tied to training, and they're tied to morale. And yes, the Canadians did suffer lots of casualties in Normandy. There is no doubt about that. But there's a perspective amongst Canadians, and even a lot of people that have studied the issues, that this is inordinate in comparison to everybody else. I put to you that when you look at the stats, actually, what happened was that the small Canadian Army was in the fight pretty much right from day one all the way out to the end of World War II. We had in a Canadian Army that had 2 divisions in Italy fighting at the same time and 3 divisions in Northwest Europe. We did not have the luxury of being able to pull a division out of the line to have rest and refit. Our divisions were constantly in the fight, committed, and yes, they took a lot of casualties. We had a lot of people moving forward all the time, but when you look at the numbers from the statistics here, and based on intense combat, and the table here lists within the British and what would become the Commonwealth Corps, so right from the British 3rd, 15th, 43rd, 49th, 51st, the Scottish 51st, the 53rd Division, and you look at the 2 Canadian divisions. As you look at June through September, the amount of days in intense combat, Canadian divisions, 31 and 30 days of intense combat. which is significantly higher than the other British divisions that were out there. And when you look at the total number of casualties, yes, the numbers are very, very high. But when you look at the casualties per day, intense combat, you know, you can look at the total, and then when you look at the total number of casualties per day, we actually did very well. Those divisions were in the fight much longer. They didn't have the chance to pull out and be replaced by another Canadian division. It was only in 1945 when we brought our 2 divisions from Italy up into the fight. So when we talk about it from the historical context of, well, Canadian leadership was inexperienced, Canadian soldiers were inexperienced, you know, they did not handle the tactical situation as well as they could have and should have. We suffered needless casualties. The facts actually don't carry themselves out. And I'll refer you to a quote from the 12th SS Hitler Jugend Division. We'll be talking about that in a little bit here, where they speak very highly of the Canadian soldiers that they fought. So when we as Canadians are speaking poorly about our World War II Army, the stats don't carry that out, and certainly our opponents did not have that opinion about the Canadians. So when we talk about, you know, what was accomplished, the Canadians landed within our sector. This map here lays out the various regiments and how they advanced across the ground. In fact, the Canadians were the only ones, the only of the Allied armies to reach their D-Day objectives, which is right down here at Phase Line Oak, just to the west of Caen. And Carpiquet Airfield, those of you that have been in Normandy, Carpiquet Airfield still exists today. It's in a suburb of Caen, right at the edge of town. Canadians actually reached their objectives. They were the only Allied army to meet their objectives. And that was from tanks from the 1st Hussars who did that. So D-Day itself, tremendous achievement. But we did suffer quite a few casualties. 354 killed in action. That number itself, that's the second highest dead on the beaches. Bloody Omaha, of course, led. And unfortunately, in terms of the casualties, we had the second highest casualties, and that is because we had the second thickest defenses in terms of weapon systems, crew served, and individual that we were fighting our way through. But despite all of that, we gained tremendous lodgement. We were the only ones to hit our objectives. And as you can see, Canadian soldiers were moving forward very, very quickly. The assault was efficiently conducted. They seized their objectives, and they moved through very, very quickly. In fact, when you look at, I said about the Canadians that achieved their objectives, you had Lieutenant William McCormick from the 1st Hussars. 3 of their tanks from his troop actually made it on down there. And they reached it. The problem was the radio communication systems that they had were not as effective as our radio communication systems. And they made it down there. They only ran into isolated staff cars. They did not encounter any significant resistance, but they were out of communications range. What was happening in the back was that actually getting people through the villages was much more difficult than had been anticipated. If you're in France and you're actually going through Benny-sur-Mer and the villages down there, very, very tight and narrow streets, and clearing, despite the fact that troops were moving forward, clearing the artillery through those villages was very difficult. And it was taking more time than we had anticipated. So the troop of tanks decided, okay, we're out here all alone, on our own, we've hit our objective, but we have no infantry to support us, we have no communications, we don't know what's going on behind us. They pulled back, which is potentially a missed opportunity for us, as we'll see the following day. But they pulled back. In the meantime, the rest of both brigades, 7 and 8 Brigade, 7 on the east, 8 on the west, were busy sorting themselves out, trying to clear the villages, get the supplies unloaded, get people moving forward. It did come with casualties, like I said, 358 killed, 758 wounded in action. The picture on the left is actually Canadian soldiers marching into captivity in Caen on D-Day. Those were Canadians that were captured. Remember that we had Canadians that were also jumping as part of the airborne drop ahead of the main body. We'll have a look at some German propaganda footage. In the propaganda footage earlier on in what you see, there's actually some Canadian infantrymen who are taken prisoner in that. So these are Canadian soldiers that are being marched into captivity. Predominantly those would be from the fights along the beachhead. And then on the 8th of June, this is B Company from Royal Winnipeg Rifles, soldiers, again, that were at Caen, taken into captivity before they would be processed. We're going to kick off with the battle at the Arden Abbey. Arden Abbey stands to this day, very, very ancient structure. It's on the outskirts of Caen. It is one of those historical places that I think most Canadians are unaware of, but it is truly one of those places that you should visit. When you're in Normandy, yes, you can go to the Juno Beach Center, you can go to Juno Beach, and I don't want to take away from that, but if you want to understand Canadians and the story of Canadians, who we are, and ultimately our system of justice and our system of values, you should go to the Arden Abbey, because the Arden Abbey is central to the fighting of the Canadian Army both on the 7th of June and throughout the rest of the month of June into early July, and in early July when we finally seize it. The Abbey itself has been rebuilt, and you'll see some pictures of what it looked like after the fighting. And I will just point out this one turret right here. That one turret you'll see shortly. The Abbey itself actually forms Kurt Meyer's divisional headquarters. He starts off as a regimental commander fighting the Canadians. He becomes a divisional commander when his boss gets taken out several days later by a broadside from a British battleship. But this is the divisional headquarters. This in the compound is the divisional headquarters of the Hitler Youth Division as they fight the Canadians. And the issue of the Canadian prisoners there is one we will talk about. Okay, 6th of June, what happens? German officers are off. German officers are preparing. They're doing what we call a TOOT, tactical exercise without troops, to rehearse dealing with an Allied invasion in France. Kurt Meyer decides to stay with his troops, and as such, when the initial reports of the invasion take place, he is on the phone and he gets his troops moving in the direction of Normandy as quickly as possible. Regimental commander, but he can do that. He's been empowered to do that. His troops start moving on the 6th of June as we start moving, getting our bridgehead and lodgement in place. This right here, this is from the 2nd Battalion of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment. This would be one of the tanks that would be facing the Canadians on the 7th of June. You'll recall I pointed out the turret in the Arden Abbey. This is actually Kurt Meyer and his brigade team. They're in the turret. That is a turret that you saw. And they're looking at the Canadians coming from the area of Juno Beach. And they're monitoring them, looking at the Canadian layout as the Canadians make their way through Buron in the direction of Outy. And they're planning their counterattack against the Canadians. They can see the Canadians coming. They know the Canadians were successful. They know the direction that they're coming from, and they're able to take advantage of, the high ground where they can see the entire panorama in front of them and plan their counterattack, which would be done on the morning of the 7th of June. In Caen, the regiment has moved forward on the 6th and 7th of June. This image here it's reported to be on the morning of the 7th of June. I'll have to take that for what it's worth. So the troops are here. Canadians have started their advance, and they are moving to clear the villages to their front to seize the Carpiquet airfield, which was their objective for day one, but they're moving forward now on D-Day +1, the 7th of June, to seize Carpiquet airfield. In the meantime, these troops have moved forward from their assembly area north of Paris. They moved on the 6th and 7th of June. They're in position, and they'll be meeting the troops in a couple of hours. This scene right here, those of you that have been to the Arden Abbey, this is actually what is today the front entrance of the Arden Abbey. And that's changed a little bit. The side entrance that we would call the side entrance today was the front entrance then. This is now the front entrance. And here on the morning of the around 1100 on the 7th of June, you have the Panzer Grenadiers are moving into location. They're getting themselves ready to launch shortly to attack the Canadians. We have a meeting engagement. So the Canadians launched. The Canadians started moving, clearing out that morning, started clearing out the Canadians, taking some of the villages. And again, if you've been in here, you know the roads are not straight roads like we have. They're narrow. These are old tracks that go back several hundreds, if not thousands of years. The villages have grown up around them. It's very difficult to maneuver through. Individual snipers and layback teams and some of the defensives were back there. But again, it takes time to get yourself organized, particularly when you have a Green Army, to move forward. So the Canadians were moving forward, seizing the towns, and the Arden Abbey is right over here. The Arden Abbey, what you saw was Kurt Meyer looking out on the battle space, seeing the Canadians advancing, and preparing. Right, we'll be attacking with my regiment, the 25th SS Panzer Regiment, and the 26th SS Panzer Regiment will be advancing along what is today the highway out to Bayou. His regiment, Kurt Meyer's, would attack 9 Brigade, and 26 would attack the 7 Brigade. This is some of the imagery which is taken from German combat camera. So what we call combat camera, they were called propaganda companies in those days. So this is some of the imagery that was taken from that. Again, German tanks moving forward from the 2nd Battalion to attack the Canadians. You'll notice they're in the open. This will change. These are green troops too. They're not used to the Allied air power that would devastate the German army in Normandy. They're not used to that. They have never encountered that. When you look at the Luftwaffe fought for years on the Eastern Front. Experienced fighter wings were chewed up and spat out within a month. None of them had encountered the volume and the quality of troops that they were about to encounter. So when you look at German panzers and you can say, yeah, they're experienced troops, some of the leadership was experienced, but none of them had encountered what the Allied army would become in Normandy. And they're moving in the open with limited camouflage, and they're moving into position. This image was actually taken from the war diaries of the 12th SS Panzer Regiment, so the division's Panzer Regiment. And unfortunately, the infantry battalions don't write like the armor guys do. The armor guys like to write their history. So the armor regiment wrote its history. This image actually comes from them, and it matches pretty closely to what the Canadians encountered and what the Canadians reported afterwards. So based on the Arden Abbey, the counterattack into the flank with 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment fighting in the direction of Rotz, and here to seize Oti, the village of Oti, and the village of Buron. Now this area right in here, and you'll see some pictures that I took this past August of that space. This is where the Canadian Army fought for the next month, that area. And it is a very small area. What you see from my imagery is, that's where they fought, that whole area. So this is just to this boundary right here. This fence is at the edge of the Arden Abbey. That road right there is a German line of departure for their counterattack into the flank of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. And Lieutenant Radley Walters later became Major Radley Walters. He was part of that regiment advancing. And they would launch from here and they would attack into the Canadian flank. This is a couple of meters. The picture that I took, if you look at that little bush over there, that's roughly where I was standing when I took the picture. So these are the Panzer Grenadiers right next to the Arden Abbey, preparing themselves for the counterattack. This is north of the Abbey, so my back is to the Abbey. I'm looking at the field in front of it. This would become the battlefield. Canadian Army would finally take this in early July. Germans would be coming from the left of the image. Arden Abbey being just off the image over here. Canadians were advancing from the right of the image, and it would be a meeting engagement in this field, both to the left of the modern road and to the right of the modern road. And this is what the Canadians would be looking at in the modern context. If you're a tank troop leader in the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, you're looking in this direction and you're moving forward. And this is from the German perspective. As you're advancing, you have the villages of Oti first, with Buron in the distance. And the villages themselves are pretty much one leads into the next. The Germans would have the Arden Abbey off on their right flank. Again, this imagery is taken from German propaganda film. Tanks have moved up, taken advantage of the ground, moved into position, and started engaging Canadian tanks. Canadian tanks get brewed up quite quickly at the beginning, as the crews were not expecting the counterattack. And of course, being propaganda, they'll show you the images which suit their purposes. This is one of the tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. Some of the Canadian infantrymen who were captured, I will suggest this was staged, because you're not going to have that many infantrymen that will surrender, nor will they surrender without any of their fighting order and helmets and the like. So again, some of the creative liberty that was taken by the propaganda company. All that said, these were Canadian soldiers that were captured during the morning of the 7th of June on that field. Again, a captured Canadian Bren gun carrier from one of the 2 Canadian infantry battalions of the brigade, and one of the German commanders inspecting a Sherman tank that they had knocked out. This is a Sherman Firefly that they had knocked out. You'll notice the turret. The turret is off to the flank, and the entry is on the side. So the Canadians were looking one way when they got shot from the flank. The turret quickly spun to try and engage the direction of the target, but they got shot in the side. Again, unexpected, and that unfortunately does happen, because when you're looking in one direction, it's flank security, which is always important. That's where the enemy's going to come from. One of the penetration holes. A Canadian sweatshirt dropped at the side of one of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers burning tanks, Royal Canadian Armour Corps sweatshirt. And the recce elements, having gone and passed through the Canadian tanks, the recce elements are moving forward to take on their next task. And the tanks move forward, having done that engagement, to engage more of the infantry. Infantry following in behind, the Panzer Grenadiers, passing through the Canadian tanks. Okay, so the front line on the 7th through to the 10th of June. So the Germans came out from the Arden Abbey, as you can see right down here on the bottom right, did their flank attack into OT, forward to Grouchy and Buron, and the 26th SS Regiment went into Rotz. But the Canadians held them. The Canadians did an outstanding job. When you look at the Royal Regina Rifles at Rotz, was a very, very difficult and tough fight. It was a 26th Regiment, which was reinforced by Panther Tanks, moving in that direction. They actually didn't get too far. It was a great defensive fight that was done there, and the brigade actually held them very, very tight. And here, yes, we got engaged. The Canadian success at OT and Buron, we were pushed back. But the consequence of that, actually, the Germans lost so much combat power that they lost their ability to move forward. So, a little bit of a difficult diagram here, but the situation stabilizes after the afternoon fights. They don't fight like we do in the modern context. At night, things tended to slow down, and they stabilized on the 7th and 10th, 7th through the 10th, and then the Canadian Army would fight over this ground over the next month as we built up sufficient combat power to defeat the Germans and seize Caen early in July. Some of the imagery from those fights, those early days in Normandy, 7th and 8th, this one here is one of the Panther tanks in Rotz, which is, by the way, if you have the opportunity to go to Rotz, France, a fantastic museum. The D-Day Academy, which is there, tremendous museum, weapons and uniforms from the fight. You actually get to handle them. So if you are interested in that, go to Rotz, go to the D-Day Academy, spend your 20 euros, whatever it costs. Tremendous opportunity to visit that. You have just a few blocks away, members of the 15th SS Recce Company are fighting in the village, but the Canadians held them here. It was a very tough fight, but the Canadians held them very well. This is a recovery vehicle from probably supporting the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, which is moving forward at that time. Combat losses from the engagement, that is the engagement in the afternoon of the 7th of June. You can see Canadian wounded in action, killed, prisoners of war, pretty high number. Over both brigades, a very, very high number. 21 tanks, including 7 damaged. Now these are the stats from the Tank Regiment. Tank Regiment both having the Panther Battalion and the Mark IV Battalion. Again, the infantry guys got to learn how to write. Anyways, you can see 35 killed in action and 11 tanks right in there. The loss exchange ratio, I will argue, the Germans themselves said that the ranges at which they were engaging the Canadian tanks and the Canadian anti-tank weapons, the Canadian systems and the Canadian crews were more than a match for what they were engaging. So there was a respect from the Germans for what the Canadians were able to do. So when people say, well, Canadian troops are green in Normandy and they suffered inordinate casualties, when your enemy says, no, your equipment and crews were actually very good, that speaks very highly of you. If we're looking at Tank Battalion versus Tank Regiment, so over both battalions of the SS, they suffered 35 killed in action versus the Sherbrooke Fusiliers suffered 26. So really, you know, were they as green as historians would say that they were? And that, by the way, that's That's imagery, that's Canadian imagery from the 8th and 9th of June. Some of the stretcher bearers that were involved from the 9th Infantry Brigade. So those that were most affected by the fight at the Arden Abbey. So, some of the things. Orchard north of OT, once the initial engagement, once they realized they were being hit in the flank by the Panzer Grenadiers and the tank battalions, the Canadians started to withdraw to consolidate their lines and fall back. Some of the tank crews and some of the infantry actually pulled machine guns off. And they actually set up in the orchard north of OT, they set up a strong point. And they actually held for several hours during the afternoon. They held off repeated German attacks. That was critical because that slowed down the Germans. They had been advancing very, very quickly, but what you had was junior leadership. In fact, the lieutenant from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers would later be killed at the Arden Abbey. But you had junior leadership that pulled people together, took a couple of radios, took a couple of machine guns off the tanks. The infantry and tankers pulled together, formed a strong point that took several hours. That bought time for the remaining Canadians to consolidate the line and actually hold the line later that night. That 2-hour delay causes Meyer to recognize that his mission, which was to drive the Canadians into the sea, drive a wedge between the Allied armies, have an isolated British division on his east flank, the rest of the Allied armies on the west flank, drive the Canadians into the sea, defeat the Allied toehold that they had in France, was not going to succeed. Those 2 brigades of Canadian infantry and tank soldiers suffered tremendous losses. We saw that already. But through their delay action, they caused the Germans to lose so much combat power that already by the night of the 7th of June, Kurt Meyer, whose orders were to drive the Canadians into the sea, recognizes it's not going to happen. The German plan to drive the Allies into the sea and defeat the Allied invasion failed that night. And it failed predominantly because of the tough fight that our junior leadership and our soldiers put together that afternoon. Took so much time, took so much combat power that the Germans did not have the strength to actually move forward and hit what had become a temporary defensive line that the Canadians established. And again, when we talk about Normandy, we don't give the Canadians credit for that. It was the 7th of June was a tremendous defensive fight. Yes, we lost a lot of soldiers, both captured, wounded, and killed. But we managed to defeat the German counterattack, which was to drive us into the sea. We defeated that, we held it, and we created the conditions whereby the buildup of Allied forces could take place and the eventual destruction of the German army in Normandy, which ironically the pocket was closed by the South Alberta Regiment, which is perpetuated by the South Alberta Light Horse here. So some of the impacts of risks, those of you that are interested in military history, pulling back the tanks on the 6th of June, having a troop of tanks out there, yes, without communications. How would that have changed the fight a day later if you had had those guys out there? That's an interesting discussion, and it speaks to leadership. It speaks to being prepared to accept risks without communication in the middle of no man's land. How do you handle a situation like that? I can't, but that's something that if you're military you might want to be considering. Recce pull. When you're moving forward, the enemy is actually doing an attack on you. Recce pull on both sides. The reconnaissance to have a good understanding where people were coming from. You saw on the German side, the German commander was able to move to the high ground and see the Canadians advancing, see how they were laid out, to lay his forces for an appropriate counterattack. If we'd had different assets, could things have worked out a little bit better? Flanking formations, yep, much more difficult go on the east side because of the nature of the terrain, and of course fire support. At a critical moment when the Germans were launching the counterattack, inevitably, we see in the military, all major battles are fought at the intersection of 3 map sheets at night in the rain. Well, at a critical moment when the German counterattack was going in, communications with Battleship Row, who were providing a lot of the deep artillery fire support, was lost. And it was only regained later on when they took one of the radios off one of the tanks so that they could get that in. That fire support from our naval brethren was actually critical to help provide the fire support to slow the Germans down and to hold them in location. But again, planning for the worst case scenario. I'll leave you with this. Hubert Meyer. Hubert Meyer is what we would call the divisional G3, divisional operations officer for the 12th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. That, in fact, that's him right there. That's an image which was taken at the Arden Abbey. You probably recognize the back of the building there when it was the divisional command post. You can read what he said about the Canadians. Canadians on the 7th and 8th of June. Our opponents were especially strong in the defensive. They did not allow themselves to be surprised. They fought ferociously and bravely. Some of the images from later on that month, as the Canadians are consolidating and slowly moving forward to chew away at the German defenses. And fighting the 3rd through the 10th of July, and again we have the Arden Abbey, which is right here. And you can see 3rd through the 10th of July, we're still fighting on the same ground. Grouchy, Buron, Outy, Rots over here. Canadians, in the meantime, the Canadians have moved down south of the highway, the Caen-Bayou Highway, and they're moving in, they're clearing Carpiquet Airfield as we close into Caen to eventually defeat the enemy at Caen. But you'll notice too, the German tanks are heavily camouflaged by this point in time. Tremendous casualties that they faced. Again, some of the imagery from the Canadian fight as we close up to the Arden Abbey. Jacques Vicault would be Radley Walters. Radley Walters by this point in time had gone from being a troop leader to being the squadron commander of B Squadron Sherbrooke Fusiliers, which would seize the Arden Abbey. He was supporting the Regina Rifles. Jacques Vicault was his French resistance guide in the area. Jacques Vicault's family were actually the gardeners of the Arden Abbey. He knew the ground very, very well. So he was the squadron commander's guide for that fight. Jacques was a tremendous gentleman to talk to and explain what actually took place during that fighting. And you can see by July, the Abbey itself, very, very different shape. And this gateway here, this gateway is now the main entrance for those of you that visit the Arden Abbey. The side entrance, which you'll see shortly, is no longer in use. So when we're talking about the casualties throughout the Normandy campaign, day 1, 6th of June, very high numbers. But when you're looking at the 8th and 9th of July, so the final seizing of the Arden Abbey and Caen, the numbers are pretty close. That final fight, that final couple of yards, a month later is pretty similar to what we actually had to deal with on day 1 of the fight. 25th of July, when we're talking Verrières Ridge, just outside of Caen itself, would actually be the Canadian Army's most bloody day in all of World War II. So that is south of Caen. Again, numbers pretty similar, but again, very high. The final closing campaign of the Normandy campaign, those 2 weeks, or just shy of 2 weeks, close to 1,500 killed in action. A very, very high casualty numbers, and as you can see, just over 5,000 killed in action throughout the entire Normandy campaign. So what happened on those Canadian soldiers that you saw that were taken into captivity? You didn't see them all. I mean, the numbers themselves. Well over 100 soldiers were captured on the 7th of June. In a couple of places, war crimes were committed. And, Arden Abbey, on the 7th of June, 11 Canadians were executed. On the 8th of June, another 7. And then on the 17th of June, 2 Canadians were executed. Puteaux-en-Bessin, so to the west of that, in the area of the 7th Brigade, changed hands twice back and forth, very, very close combat fighting. Some of the Canadian infantrymen hacked to bits, stabbed, driven over by armored fighting vehicles. 45 of 64 Canadian PWs taken in those fights were actually executed. And then Buron and Outy, 37 PWs and Canadian PWs in SS custody were executed. What I want to draw attention to is, on the 7th of June already, Kurt Meyer recognized that he did not have the combat power to defeat the Canadians. When you look at the dates when Canadians were executed, it was the 7th and 8th of June. On the German side, you had leadership that had grown up and matured on the Eastern Front, and they had been imbued with a certain fighting spirit, and they treated Canadian PWs accordingly. What changed? Why did suddenly on the 7th and 8th of June, shortly after that, all those executions end? It's because they realized that they were not able to defeat the Canadians. They would not be on the winning side. that the Allies actually had a toehold and the Allies were coming after them. So when you talk with Jacques Vicault and you ask him and you talk to the other historians in Normandy, you know, what changed? And their comment, you know, all of them have said, their comment is that the German infantrymen suddenly realized that, guess what? There's a very good chance that you're going to be in custody, and you're going to be in custody shortly, or you're going to be dead. So the behavior was modified very quickly as they realized that this fight was not going their way. And it would be a long time. The Canadians would continue to face the SS Hitler Youth Division throughout June, July, and we would chew them up and spit them out at the end of, in August. But it would be a very, very difficult fight against those highly motivated troops. But when it came down to the war crimes that were committed against Canadian soldiers, predominantly on the 7th and 8th of June, that would end for the most part. But, you know, there was a memory there. There was a memory in that fight. And the fight was very brutal between the Canadian divisions and the Hitler Youth. I talked about the Arden Abbey. So the front and side gate. As you approach the Arden Abbey, the side gate, which was the front gate, here again being used. So when you're walking about the Arden Abbey, just remember orienting yourself that what is the front door today was actually the side door then, and that's where a lot of the German imagery is based in there, going to their headquarters. Okay, so I was in 2004. I was at the Arden Abbey. I met Charlie Doucet's family. His daughter, his granddaughter, well, his daughter and his grandchildren, little memorial service in the Canadian Garden where the Canadians were taken and shot. I met Charlie Doucet's family. Very emotional for them to see where one of their ancestors had been taken and where he had been shot. Mi'kmaq from New Brunswick. Again, he volunteered to serve his country in the cause of freedom and to liberate France, and he paid the ultimate price. The reports, when you look at the reports of what was taking place, Canadians were held in the stables over here. They'd be taken through, they would be questioned, and after some initial questioning, they would be taken into the garden, marched into the garden, and they would be executed with a pistol to the back of the head. The reports of the Canadian soldiers, they figured out pretty quickly what was going on here. Somebody gets called in, and then shortly there's a single pistol shot. The Canadian soldiers, the reports of how they carried themselves, they would shake their hands to they knew what was coming when they were called up. They went forward bravely. The reports are that, you know, they carried themselves with courage, with distinction. They would thank each other for their service, and then the soldiers would be, you know, the next guy would be called forward, knowing full well now, or anticipating full well what would happen. Jacques Vicault and his mother and his brother would actually discover the Canadian soldiers. And in the garden itself, right over here, there's a little patch where flowers grow. Flowers grew in 1944 and prior to that. Later in 1944, as the flowers were coming up, they were kind of disheveled. Jacques Vicault, his mother and the brother were in there, they were looking at the ground, and they said, well, why is this disheveled? They had heard the rumors that executions had taken place there. They did some excavations. Jacques and his family found the Canadian soldiers buried there. Hasty burials to try and cover up what they had done. Jacques, his family, of course, gave testimony as to what took place here and how they discovered them. So again, I think we as Canadians have a debt of gratitude to Jacques Vicault's family, who worked hard to identify the Canadians that were in there, make sure that the proper steps were taken so that in 1945 and 1946 we could do war crimes trials against the leaders involved with this. OT, we talked about the village of OT, and the town square is where the executions actually took place. And you know, they were the Canadians were all herded into here. We talked about how, you know, the Canadians were attacked, stabbed, vehicles driven in there. One of the Frenchmen, Jules Calville, he and his wife were in one of the houses looking at the square. Jules left the security of his house and ran out to try and put a stop to this. Jules was actually shot by the Germans, shot and killed by the Germans, trying to put a stop of the execution of Canadian soldiers. His wife ran out to try and join her husband and save him. She was injured by being shot at by the Germans. So the French villagers in OT tried to step in to save Canadian lives as well. And you'll see as you travel through Normandy little plaques in all these villages, particularly in Buron and Auty, because not only did we suffer in those villages, but the villagers suffered with us, shoulder to shoulder. The aftermath. Now what happened in Poutron-Bessin, Auty, Buron, l'Ardennes would come out later on, but the feelings and the rumors of what happened there and you know, our evidence piled up very, very quickly. And like I said, the feelings were very, very high on all sides for this. I just say here, you know, when you're looking, here's a Canadian infantryman with a captured SS Panzer Grenadier, and when you're looking at the types of injuries that the Panzer Grenadier took, you know it was a personal fight between both of them. So, December 1945, Canada convenes one of two court-martials. First of which that was done was on for Germans who killed a Canadian airman who had parachuted. But the more high-profile, the one which got front-page coverage coast to coast, was actually the one on Kurt Meyer. Kurt Meyer, here in uniform, in October 45. You know, I mean, the court-martial itself had 4 Canadian generals. Because he was a general, a German general, the court-martial would have to have Canadian generals on there. And like I said, it had it was front-page news across this country because of the level of feeling that the murders at the Arden Abbey on in religious grounds invoked in Canada, and then Auty, Buron. He was the regimental commander for what happened at the Arden Abbey, but he became, 10 days later, he became the divisional commander. It was his troops, you know, ultimately his troops who committed these war crimes, and he would stand trial for that. The charges themselves, you know, there was no 129 charge. If you're in the military, no 129 charge. The charges were serious charges here, all 5 of them. I'll leave that for you. I will point out that, you know, the highlighted part that I have in here, you know, by the Canadian Army, I was treated as a soldier, and the proceedings were fairly conducted. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death for his role as a commander. So I talked when I was chatting with Tommy DeFay, Tommy, 10 years later, he would become the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion PPCLI, and at that time, Kurt Meyer was a beer salesman. Kurt Meyer, he would invite Kurt Meyer into the officers' mess because Kurt had fought the Soviets to talk about actually how they fought the Soviets. So he became very good friends with them. This caused a bit of a stink in Canada when it came out that you had a gentleman who was convicted of a war crime. But it was interesting. Tommy mentioned to me that Kurt Meyer's SS compatriots, after he had been sentenced to death, and before the appeals had gone through, Kurt Meyer's brothers in the SS wanted to spring him out of prison. And they had put together a band, and they were prepared to go raid the Canadian prison, spring him out of prison, and bring him to freedom. And they went to Mrs. Meyer, and they asked Mrs. Meyer for permission. You know, will you support us as we go and do this? And Mrs. Meyer, her comment to them put an end to the entire thing. She said, no. The Canadians have treated him fairly, and they will treat him fairly. You know, no, you will not do this. It was actually the wife who did not give permission for them to go and raid the Canadian prison. And I asked Tommy DeFay, you know, here you are, you're the jailer, you would have been the guy that would have been taken out and shot. I asked him, so would they have been successful? And he laughed at me. I mean, said, they were the SS. Of course they would have been successful against us. But it was his wife. His wife who had sufficient confidence in the Canadian military justice system that despite the level of antagonism between both parties, that in fact he would receive a fair hearing. He would receive a fair hearing, that his appeal would be heard, and that, you know, eventually justice would be served in this. In this case, the appeal was done to the convening authority, which was Chris Vokes. And then when Chris Vokes said, you know, sorry, can't do this, can't mitigate the sentence of the court, it was an appeal to the senior Canadian combatant officer in theater, which happened to be, at that point in time, Chris Vokes. Lo and behold. So the second time it comes to Chris Vokes, and it is commuted to life imprisonment. Spent some time in Dorchester, pardon for clemency. And he had gone, he had offered to serve in the Canadian Army, he'd offered to serve in a UN Army to do things. People will allege that he had provided advice to the Canadian government in terms of how to defend the North against the Soviets. But again, transferred to the British, 1951, to their military prison in Vail. And then 1954, released from prison. Shortly thereafter, became a beer salesman, selling beer to 2 PPCLI and becoming an honorary member of the 2 PPCLI officers' mess. It's funny how within 10 years things change. So, the key things to draw from all of this were that, when you look at the Canadian Army in Normandy, I think in a lot of cases, either our historians or popular belief, it gets a bit of a bum rap. The fight from the enemy's perspective is that it was a tough army, it was well trained, it was effective, it was efficient. When you look at the type of ground that we fought over, when you look at the density of German forces, Verrières Ridge and that fight between the British and ourselves, it was the highest density of German defenses of the entire World War II. So if you look at the number of artillery pieces, you look at the number of tanks in a defensive fight, south of Caen, our army actually fought the densest concentration of German defenses throughout all of World War II. So if we were talking about people saying, well, the Canadian Army was not effective, the facts and our enemies' opinions beg to differ on that. When we're talking about the leadership, the facts would appear that we are very successful, actually. As successful, if not more successful, than some of our allied peers in the fights. And when we're talking about justice and who we are as Canadians, we clearly earn the respect of our enemies. Our enemies, the families who had, in this case, Kurt Meyer's family Kurt Meyer had been sentenced to death. But there was still a belief in the Canadian system of justice that it would be fair, and that it would listen to the facts, and that it would be just in all of this. Which I think, when you look at our legacy as Canadians, solid, hardworking, loyal, and just. Despite everything, everything that they encountered, justice would prevail, and that was understood by our former combatants, our former enemies, and our former foes. That we would be that way. I think that speaks very highly of us as a people. Certainly speaks very highly of our soldiers and their leadership in World War II. And more importantly for us as Canadians, the kind of reputation that we would carry forward in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and to this day. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat tonight and to present to you some of my observations and some of my findings.